The smell of charcoal and betrayal hung thick in the summer air. Mason Briggs stood at the edge of his father's backyard, watching his younger brother flip burgers while their dad buffed the hood of a gleaming white Tesla Model S, parked like a shrine in the driveway. "Mason, get over here." Robert Briggs' voice carried the same military bark that had shaped both his sons' childhoods. "Family photo time." Mason approached slowly, his engineering mind automatically calculating distances, angles, exit strategies. Habits died hard, especially when you'd spent the last year feeling like a stranger in your own family. Amelia Covington Brigg emerged from the house, her blonde hair catching the late afternoon sun. She wore a flowing summer dress that probably cost more than Mason's monthly rent. The same rent his father was about to discuss, judging by that familiar scowl. "There's our anniversary girl," Robert boomed, wrapping an arm around his daughter-in-law. "1 year of marriage, and look how far you two have come." Jason grinned, spatula in hand. "Dad, you didn't have to—" "Nonsense." Robert tossed a set of keys that jingled like wind chimes in the silence. "Tesla Model S, fully loaded. Consider it an early anniversary gift." Mason felt something cold settle in his stomach. He remembered when his father had promised him that same car for completing his master's degree in optical systems engineering. That was 3 years ago, before everything went sideways. "Holy smoke!" Jason caught the keys like he was fielding a pop fly. "Dad, this is incredible! Amelia, look at this!" She squealed, and threw her arms around Jason's neck. They kissed with the enthusiasm of newlyweds, and Mason looked away, focusing instead on the neighbor's dog barking at something in the distance. "Now, Mason," Robert's tone shifted like a storm front moving in. "We need to talk about your situation." Here it comes, Mason thought, the monthly ritual. "Rent's due Sunday, $900, cash." Robert's eyes were steel gray, same color as his military buzz cut. "Or you pack your stuff and find somewhere else to crash." The backyard went quiet except for the sizzle of meat on the grill. Even the neighbor's dog had stopped barking. Jason flipped a burger with exaggerated casualness. "Maybe if you had a real job instead of whatever freelance computer nonsense you're doing, you could actually afford it." Mason's hands clenched involuntarily. "I'm between contracts." "Between contracts," Jason repeated, chuckling. "That's rich. What happened to that big defense job you were bragging about?" "Oh, wait," he snapped his fingers. "You walked out because you couldn't handle the pressure." "I didn't walk out." Mason's voice was steady, controlled. "I refused to sign their NDA because something stank about their procurement process." "Something stank?" Amelia finally spoke, her voice carrying that cultivated Southern accent she'd picked up at boarding school. "Or you just couldn't hack it in the real world?" The real world. As if Mason hadn't spent 6 years designing targeting systems for military drones. As if he hadn't held security clearances these people could only dream about. "I couldn't hack covering up fraud," Mason said quietly. Robert stepped forward, chest puffed out. "You watch your mouth about Amelia's family business. Victor Covington built that company from nothing." "Built it on what?" Mason shot back. "Success," Jason interjected. "Something you might recognize if you ever stuck with anything long enough." The words hit like physical blows. Mason had heard variations of this speech for months now, ever since he'd walked away from Covington Dynamics and their dirty money. Ever since Amelia had suddenly broken their engagement and started showing up to family dinners with his brother. "You know what your problem is, Mason?" Robert was warming up now, finding his rhythm. "You think you're too good for honest work, too smart for the rest of us. Well, let me tell you something." "No." Mason's voice cut through the tirade like a blade. "Let me tell you something." He looked around the circle of faces. His father's righteous anger, Jason's smug satisfaction, Amelia's cold indifference. His mother Linda stood in the kitchen window, watching through the glass with concern etched on her features. "I spent 3 years designing systems that save soldiers' lives. I walked away from a $250,000 salary because I wouldn't put my name on cooked books and fraudulent contracts. And you," he pointed at Jason, "you married into that corruption and now you're driving their payoff car." Jason's face flushed red. "You're just jealous because I succeeded where you failed." "Succeeded at what?" "Sleeping with my fiancée while I was deployed for 6 months." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the grill seemed to stop sizzling. Amelia's composure finally cracked. "That's not how it happened, and you know it." "How did it happen, Amelia?" Mason stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than shouting. Because I remember proposing to you right here in this backyard. I remember planning our wedding. I remember coming home from that last contract to find you wearing my brother's ring instead of mine. Things changed, she said, but her voice wavered. Things changed the moment I refused to sign Victor's NDA. The moment I started asking questions about those Iranian uranium contracts, remember? The ones that mysteriously got approved despite sanctions? Robert grabbed Mason's shoulder, squeezing hard enough to leave bruises. You're out of line, son. Mason shrugged off the grip with surprising strength. I'm not your son, not anymore, not since you chose sides. The physical confrontation escalated quickly. Robert shoved Mason backward and Mason stumbled but didn't fall. Years of military training, even as a contractor, had left him with reflexes that kicked in automatically. You want to do this? Mason straightened up, rolling his shoulders. Right here in front of your golden boy and his stolen bride? Jason dropped the spatula and stepped between them. Dad, don't. He's not worth it. But Robert was already swinging, a wide haymaker aimed at Mason's jaw. Mason ducked, caught his father's wrist, and twisted just enough to send the older man spinning off balance. Robert crashed into the grill, sending burgers flying and hot coals scattering across the patio. Jesus Christ. Amelia screamed, jumping back as sparks flew. Jason rushed his brother, tackling him around the waist. They went down hard, rolling across the grass in a tangle of limbs and rage. Mason was stronger, but Jason fought dirty, going for pressure points and soft tissue. Stop it! Linda's voice cut through the chaos as she burst through the patio door. Stop it right now! Mason broke free, breathing hard, grass stains on his shirt and a cut above his left eye where Jason's elbow had connected. He looked around at the devastation. Overturned grill, scattered food, his father clutching his wrist, his brother bleeding from a split lip. You made your choice, Mason said, his voice eerily calm. All of you. He walked toward the house, stopping only to look back once. Good luck. That night, Mason packed everything he owned into 2 duffel bags and a backpack. It didn't take long. He'd been living like a transient for months anyway, never quite settling in because some part of him had known this day was coming. He left a note on the refrigerator, held in place by a magnet shaped like the state of Texas. You made your choice. Good luck. Then he walked out into the darkness and disappeared. But disappearing wasn't the same as giving up, and Mason Brigg had never been much of a quitter. 6 months later, Mason sat in a coffee shop in Seattle's Capitol Hill district, reading the business section of the Seattle Times while rain drummed against the windows. According to the article, Covington Dynamics had just landed a $3 billion contract to develop next-generation surveillance drones for the Department of Defense. The photo showed Victor Covington shaking hands with a Pentagon official, while a smaller inset picture featured the happy couple, Jason and Amelia, at some charity gala, her in diamonds, him in a tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's cars. Fascinating reading? Mason looked up to find a woman in her mid-30s studying him with intelligent dark eyes. She had the kind of face that belonged in a boardroom or a courtroom. Sharp cheekbones, no-nonsense haircut. The posture of someone who'd learned not to take crap from anyone. Depends on your definition of fascinating, Mason replied, closing the paper. Mind if I sit? All the other tables are taken. It was true. The coffee shop was packed with the usual Seattle mix of tech workers, artists, and students trying to escape the eternal drizzle. Be my guest. She extended a hand as she settled into the chair across from him. Shireen Vega, Compliance Consulting, Mark Stevens. The fake name rolled off his tongue easily. He'd been practicing it for months. Systems engineering. What kind of systems? The kind that keep people alive in hostile environments? Shireen smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Military contractor? Former. I had a philosophical disagreement with my last employer. About what? Mason studied her face, looking for tells. She had the controlled expression of someone who'd spent time in interrogation rooms, either asking questions or answering them. They wanted me to put my signature on something that would get people terminated. I declined. Terminated as in fired? Terminated as in permanently horizontal? Understanding flickered in Shireen's eyes. One of those disagreements. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the ambient noise of the coffee shop washing over them like white noise. Finally, Shireen leaned forward slightly. Want to know something interesting about compliance consulting? Sure. Most of my work involves investigating companies that think they're too smart to get caught. Defense contractors are the worst. They assume their government connections make them untouchable. Mason kept his expression neutral. Is that so? Take Covington Dynamics, for example. She gestured at the newspaper. Beautiful company. Generational wealth, political connections going back decades, and dirty as a pig farm. What makes you say that? Shireen pulled out her phone and scrolled through what looked like financial documents. 3 years ago, they won a contract to develop targeting systems for drone platforms. The winning bid was 40% below the next closest competitor. That's aggressive pricing. It's impossible pricing, unless you're cutting corners somewhere, or someone's feeding you inside information, or both. Mason's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice level. You sound like you've given this some thought. I should. I used to work there. The words hung in the air like smoke. Mason felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, not the whole picture yet, but enough to see the shape of something larger. Used to? Until I found irregularities in their procurement process and reported them through proper channels. Shireen's laugh was bitter. Turns out proper channels means directly to the people profiting from the irregularities. What happened? Constructive dismissal. They made my life so miserable I had to quit or have a nervous breakdown. Standard corporate warfare stuff. Mason leaned back in his chair, mind racing. And now you're freelance. Now I help other people fight back. Pro bono mostly. There's not much money in taking down billionaires, but the work is satisfying. How satisfying? Shireen's smile turned carnivory. Depends how much patience you have and how creative you're willing to get. Over the next hour, Mason learned that Shireen Vega was exactly what she appeared to be. A brilliant, bitter ex-corporate insider with a talent for forensic accounting and AI personal vendetta against the defense contracting industry. She'd been building cases against corrupt contractors for 3 years, working with a network of whistleblowers, investigative journalists, and activist lawyers. The thing about these companies, she explained over a second cup of coffee, is that they're built on relationships, personal connections, family ties. They think that makes them strong, but it actually makes them vulnerable. How so? When everyone's related or connected, information flows in predictable patterns. People get careless. They assume their secrets are safe because they're all in the same club. But there's always someone on the outside looking in, someone who got pushed out or passed over. Someone with access to the right information and the wrong attitude. Mason felt a chill of recognition. Someone like you. Someone like me, or... She gave him a meaningful look. Someone like you. They talked for another 2 hours, and by the time they parted ways, Mason had a new job. Officially, he was a senior systems analyst for Cascade Technical Solutions, a small defense subcontractor that specialized in drone navigation systems. Unofficially, he was Shireen's inside man in the defense contracting world, positioned to gather intelligence on the companies she was targeting. Covington Dynamics was at the top of her list. Over the following weeks, Mason threw himself into building his new identity. Mark Stevens was everything Mason Brigg wasn't. Clean background, uncontroversial employment history, no family drama or corporate enemies. He rented a small apartment in Ballard, bought a used Honda Civic, and started showing up to work every day like a model employee. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was using his engineering skills to design the same kinds of systems he'd walked away from at Covington. But now he had a different purpose. Every specification he wrote, every technical document he reviewed, every meeting he attended was an opportunity to gather intelligence. The key, Shireen explained during one of their weekly meetings, is to think like an auditor. Look for patterns, inconsistencies, things that don't add up. They met in different locations each time, sometimes coffee shops, sometimes bookstores, once in the back row of a movie theater during a Tuesday matinee. Shireen was paranoid about surveillance, and with good reason. She'd shown him articles about other whistleblowers who'd suffered mysterious accidents or sudden career implosions. Covington has a reputation for playing hardball, she warned. They've got private investigators, cybersecurity firms, lawyers who specialize in making problems disappear. If they figure out what we're doing, they won't, Mason assured her. But privately, he was beginning to understand the scope of what they were up against. Covington Dynamics wasn't just a defense contractor. It was a political institution. Victor Covington sat on advisory boards, attended state dinners, played golf with senators and Pentagon officials. The company's tentacles reached into every level of government. Taking them down would require more than just evidence of wrongdoing. It would require a strategy that accounted for their political protection, their financial resources, and their willingness to destroy anyone who threatened their interests. We need leverage, Shireen said during one of their meetings. Something personal, something that hits them where they're vulnerable. Mason knew exactly what she meant. For all their power and influence, the Covingtons had the same weakness as every wealthy family. They cared more about their reputation than their money. "What do you know about the family dynamics?" he asked. "Victor's a control freak. Classic narcissist. Amelia's his only child, so she's being groomed to take over eventually. But there are whispers." "What kind of whispers?" "Marital problems, financial irregularities in her personal accounts. Rumor has it she's been moving money around, setting up offshore accounts. Could be tax avoidance, could be something else." Mason felt a familiar cold anger settling in his chest. "What about her husband?" "Jason Brigg, small fish. Middle management at a tech startup that does work for Covington subsidiaries. He's there because of his connections, not his competence." "Connections?" "His wife, obviously. But word is he's got his own side projects. Crypto investments, real estate deals, the kind of stuff that looks legitimate on paper but gets complicated when you dig deeper." They were building a case, layer by layer, document by document. Mason's position at Cascade gave him access to industry databases, contract records, and networking events, where loose tongues and flowing booze created opportunities for intelligence gathering. 6 weeks into his new life, Mason attended a defense contracting conference in Portland. The ballroom of the downtown Marriott was packed with military officials, corporate executives, and the usual collection of lobbyists and influence peddlers who orbited the defense industry like satellites around a planet. He was nursing a whiskey at the bar when he spotted a familiar face across the room. Jason looked good. Better than good. He looked successful. Expensive suit, confident posture, the kind of easy smile that came from knowing you were winning. He was deep in conversation with a group of executives, gesturing animatedly while they laughed at his jokes. Mason felt the old anger rise in his throat like bile, but he forced it down. This wasn't about personal revenge anymore. This was about justice. He spent the evening circulating through the crowd, collecting business cards and making connections. By the time the reception ended, he had invitations to 3 different networking events and the phone numbers of 4 procurement officials who might be willing to discuss Covington's bidding practices off the record. More importantly, he'd overheard Jason bragging about a new investment opportunity, something involving cryptocurrency mining and government contracts that was going to make him independently wealthy within 2 years. When Mason called Shireen the next morning, she was practically vibrating with excitement. Crypto mining with government contracts? That's either incredibly stupid or incredibly illegal. Why not both? We need to dig deeper. Can you get close to him? Mason thought about it. Jason had always been careless with information, especially when he was trying to impress people. And there was something delicious about the idea of his brother unwittingly providing the rope for his own hanging. I can try. Be careful. If he recognizes you, he won't. I'm not the same person who walked out of that backyard. And it was true. 6 months of careful planning had changed Mason in ways that went beyond the new name and fake background. He moved differently now, thought differently. He'd learned to be patient, to think 3 moves ahead, to see patterns where others saw only coincidence. He was becoming someone his brother and his former fiancée had never imagined he could be, someone dangerous. The opportunity came 3 weeks later at an industry mixer in downtown Seattle. Mason arrived early, positioned himself near the registration table, and waited. According to the guest list Shireen had obtained through her contacts, Jason was scheduled to attend as a representative of his tech startup. When Jason walked through the door at exactly 7:15, Mason barely recognized him. His brother had put on weight, the soft, expensive kind that came from too many business dinners and not enough physical activity. His hair was perfectly styled, his suit clearly custom-tailored, and he wore a watch that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. But it was his expression that struck Mason most forcefully. Jason carried himself with the unmistakable arrogance of someone who'd never been told no, never faced real consequences, never had to question whether he deserved his success. That was about to change. Mason intercepted him at the bar, timing his approach perfectly. "Excuse me, aren't you Jason Brigg? From Nexus Solutions?" Jason turned, his face lighting up with the automatic smile of a man who loved being recognized. "That's right. And you are?" "Mark Stevens, Cascade Technical." Mason extended his hand. "I've been following your work on the defense integration project. Impressive stuff." "Well, thank you." Always nice to meet someone who appreciates innovation in the space. Mason signaled the bartender. Can I buy you a drink? I'd love to hear more about your cryptocurrency initiative. Jason's eyes widened slightly. How did you? That's not exactly public knowledge. Nothing stays secret long in this industry, especially when it's as potentially lucrative as what you're working on. For the next hour, Mason played the role of eager admirer and potential investor. He asked the right questions, made the right comments, and slowly drew Jason into revealing details about his various side projects. The cryptocurrency scheme was even more audacious than Shireen had suspected. Jason had partnered with a group of investors to create a mining operation that used excess power from government facilities during off-peak hours. The arrangement was technically legal, but ethically questionable, and it relied heavily on Jason's connections through Covington Dynamics to secure the necessary permissions and contracts. The beauty of it, Jason explained, leaning in conspiratorially, is that we're essentially getting free electricity in exchange for a small percentage of our mining profits. The government gets to say they're supporting innovation, we get to mine cryptocurrency at almost zero marginal cost, and everyone wins. What about regulatory oversight? Mason asked innocently. That's the best part. The contracts are structured as research partnerships, so they fall under different regulations. Less scrutiny, more flexibility. Mason nodded appreciatively while mentally cataloging every detail. And your wife's family company is okay with this? I mean, given their position in the industry. Jason's expression darkened slightly. Amelia's father doesn't need to know every detail of my business affairs. He's got his empire. I'm building mine. Of course. Smart to maintain some independence. Exactly. Jason finished his whiskey and signaled for another. Between you and me, Victor Covington is old school. He doesn't understand the new economy. Digital assets, distributed computing, blockchain technology, it's all foreign to him. But not to your wife? Amelia? Jason laughed, but there was an edge to it. She's smart enough, but she's focused on traditional defense contracting. Government relations, regulatory compliance, that kind of thing. She leaves the innovative stuff to me. Mason filed that information away for later use. Must be nice having that kind of partnership. It has its advantages, Jason agreed. Though lately, he trailed off, staring into his drink. Lately what? Jason looked around the room, then leaned closer. Can I trust you to keep this between us? Of course. Things have been complicated at home. Amelia's under a lot of pressure from her father about the business. There are some regulatory issues they're dealing with, and she's been tense. Mason's pulse quickened. Regulatory issues? Nothing serious. Just some questions about a few contracts. You know how the government is. They audit everything twice and then audit the audits. But it's got her spooked. That must be stressful for both of you. It is. And when Amelia gets stressed, Jason paused, as if realizing he was about to say too much. She what? Let's just say she has ways of dealing with stress that don't always involve her husband. The words hung in the air like a confession. Mason felt pieces of the puzzle sliding into place. Not just the business corruption he and Shireen were investigating, but something more personal, something that could be leveraged. I'm sorry to hear that, Mason said carefully. Marriage is challenging enough without external pressures. Tell me about it. Some days I wonder if she married me, or if she married the convenience of having someone to handle the parts of the business her father doesn't want to deal with. Bingo. Mason fought to keep his expression neutral while his mind raced. Jason wasn't just participating in financial fraud. He was doing it while his marriage fell apart, which meant he was vulnerable, careless, and likely to make mistakes. Well, Mason said, raising his glass, here's to building something that's entirely yours. They drank to that, and Mason spent the rest of the evening extracting more details about Jason's various schemes. By the time they parted ways, he had enough information to keep Shireen busy for weeks. But more importantly, he had confirmation that the family that had betrayed him was rotting from the inside. The next morning, Mason called Shireen from a secure phone. We need to meet. I've got news. They met at Pike Place Market, walking among the crowds of tourists while they talked. The noise and chaos provided natural cover for their conversation. How much of this can you verify? Shireen asked after Mason had filled her in. Most of it. The cryptocurrency mining operation should leave a paper trail. The government contracts are public record, even if the details are classified. And if Amelia's having an affair, that's personal leverage, not legal evidence. But it's still leverage. These people care about their reputations above everything else. Scandal is their kryptonite. Shireen was quiet for a moment, watching a fishmonger toss salmon for the entertainment of the crowd. "And there's something else," she said finally. "I've been working on the Covington audit and I found some interesting connections." "What kind of connections? Your brother's startup?" "It's not just a client of Covington's subsidiaries, it's essentially a shell company. 90% of its revenue comes from contracts that were awarded without competitive bidding." Mason felt his blood pressure spike. Meaning Jason's entire business is a front for funneling money out of Covington Dynamics. He's not just married into the family, he's actively participating in their fraud. They walked in silence for a few more minutes while Mason processed this information. He'd suspected Jason was crooked, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined. "There's more," Shireen continued. "I traced some of the cryptocurrency investments. The money's not just coming from Jason's personal accounts. There are transfers from accounts linked to Amelia's trust fund. She's funding his side projects, or he's stealing from her. Either way, it's another thread we can pull." Mason stopped walking and turned to face her. "How long before we have enough for a formal complaint? To the SEC? Maybe 6 weeks. To the Justice Department? Longer. These cases take time to build properly. I don't want to wait 6 weeks." Mason, or should I say Mark, patience is crucial here. If we move too fast, they'll circle the wagons and destroy evidence. We need to be surgical. But Mason's patience was wearing thin. Every day that passed was another day his family lived in luxury, while he scraped by on a fake identity and stolen moments of revenge. He wanted to see them fall, and he wanted to see it soon. "What if we could accelerate the timeline?" he asked. "How?" "What if Jason's marriage imploded publicly? What if Amelia discovered his affairs and his financial crimes at the same time? What if Victor Covington found out his son-in-law was stealing from the family business?" Shireen studied his face with concern. "You're talking about playing with fire. These people have resources. They fight back. Let them fight. I've got nothing left to lose. You've got your life to lose, and your freedom, and any chance of seeing justice done the right way." Mason looked out across Elliott Bay, watching ferries cut through the gray water toward distant islands. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to just disappear, to take a ferry to somewhere far away and start over completely, leaving all of this behind. But he couldn't. Not yet. Not until they paid for what they'd done. "Fine," he said finally. "We do this the smart way. But I want to stay close to Jason. If his marriage is falling apart, I want to be there when it happens." "Why?" "Because when people are desperate, they make mistakes. And when Jason makes mistakes, we'll be ready to capitalize on them." Shireen nodded slowly. "Okay, but we stick to the plan. Evidence first, revenge second." "Of course," Mason agreed. But privately, he was already thinking about how to collapse the timeline, how to create the kind of crisis that would force his targets into making desperate choices, how to turn their own weaknesses against them. The next phase of his plan was about to begin. 3 days later, Mason received a text from Jason's phone. "Great meeting you the other night. Interested in grabbing dinner sometime? I've got a proposition that might interest you." Mason stared at the message for a long moment before typing his reply. "Absolutely. When and where?" The response came back almost immediately. "Tomorrow night. Daniel's Broiler, 8 o'clock. Looking forward to it." Mason forwarded the conversation to Shireen with a single word: showtime. The Seattle FBI field office occupied an unremarkable building in the International District, designed to blend into the urban landscape like camouflage. Mason sat in a conference room on the 14th floor, facing 3 federal agents and a prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," said Agent Patricia Huang, the lead investigator on the case. "You're alleging that Covington Dynamics has been systematically defrauding the government for at least 3 years, and you have documentation to prove it." "That's correct." Mason opened the laptop Shireen had prepared for this moment. "What you're looking at is a pattern of bid manipulation, contract fraud, and money laundering that involves multiple companies and government officials." The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman named Catherine Walsh, leaned forward. "And your source for this information?" "I work in the industry. I've seen the contracts, attended the meetings, observed the relationships. This isn't speculation. It's first-hand observation backed by documentary evidence." "Under your real name? Or your current identity?" Agent Huang's tone was neutral, but Mason caught the implication. "My current identity is legitimate. I'm a licensed engineer working for a legitimate company. The fact that I've chosen to use a professional name rather than my birth name doesn't invalidate my observations." Walsh and Huang exchanged glances. They'd clearly done their homework on Mark Stevens' Mason Brigg, which meant they knew about his family connections to the case. "Mr. Stevens," Walsh said carefully, "we appreciate your willingness to come forward, but you must understand that any personal motivations you might have could complicate prosecution. My personal motivations are irrelevant to the evidence. Numbers don't lie because someone has a grudge." Agent Huang opened a thick folder. "Tell us about the cryptocurrency operation." For the next 2 hours, Mason walked them through everything he'd learned about Jason's schemes, Covington's fraudulent contracts, and the web of financial connections that tied it all together. Shireen's forensic work had been meticulous. Every allegation was backed by documentation, every connection verified through multiple sources. "This is impressive work," Walsh admitted when Mason finished his presentation. "But building a federal case will take time. We're talking about conducting our own investigation, securing warrants, interviewing witnesses. Could be 18 months before we're ready to file charges." 18 months? Mason fought to keep his voice level. "These people are stealing millions of dollars every quarter. How many crimes are you willing to let them commit while you build your case?" "As many as it takes to make sure they go to prison," Huang replied bluntly. "Rushing a federal prosecution is how guilty people walk free on technicalities." Mason understood the logic, but 18 months felt like an eternity. 18 months of watching his family profit from their crimes while he lived in exile under a false name. "There is another option," Walsh said slowly, "if you were willing to cooperate in an undercover capacity." "Meaning?" "Meaning we wire you up and you continue your relationship with Jason Brigg. Get him talking about his criminal activities on tape. Help us build a conspiracy case that includes everyone involved." Mason felt a familiar cold thrill. "I'm listening." "It would be dangerous," Huang warned. "These people have already demonstrated they're willing to destroy careers and reputations if they suspected you were cooperating with law enforcement." "They'd do what? Ruin my life? They already did that." Walsh and Huang conferred quietly for a moment before Walsh nodded. "Give us 2 weeks to set up the operation. In the meantime, maintain your relationship with Jason, but don't push too hard for information. We'll provide you with recording equipment and training on how to elicit admissions without raising suspicion. And in exchange? In exchange, we move this case to the front of the line. Instead of 18 months, we're talking 6 months to indictments. Maybe less if the evidence is as strong as it appears." Mason shook hands with each of them, feeling for the first time in over a year that justice might actually be possible. But as he walked out of the federal building into the gray Seattle afternoon, he was already thinking about acceleration. The FBI was willing to move fast, but not fast enough. Not compared to what Mason had in mind. He called Shireen from a coffee shop 6 blocks away. "How did it go?" she asked. "They're interested, very interested. But they want to take the slow approach." "That's good news. The federal government doesn't investigate billionaires unless they're confident they can win. They want me to go undercover, get Jason talking on tape." Shireen was quiet for a moment. "That's risky. If something goes wrong, I know. But it's also an opportunity." "For what?" "To control the timeline, to make sure this happens on our schedule, not theirs. Mason, I've got another call coming in. I'll talk to you later." It wasn't entirely a lie. His phone was buzzing with a text from Jason. "Change of plans for dinner. How about my place instead? Amelia's out of town and I've got a home theater that'll blow your mind. Plus, I want to show you some things that are easier to discuss in private." Mason stared at the message, his mind racing. Jason's place. Private conversation. Amelia out of town. This was exactly the kind of opportunity he'd been waiting for. He typed back, "Sounds perfect. What's the address?" The Brigg residence was a monument to new money. All glass and steel and architectural ambition, perched on a hillside in Bellevue with commanding views of Lake Washington. Mason sat in his Honda Civic at the end of the circular driveway, studying the house where his brother lived with his former fiancée. It should have been his house, his life, his future. Not anymore. He approached the front door at exactly 8 o'clock, carrying a bottle of wine and a small digital recorder hidden in his jacket pocket. The FBI had been clear about the legal requirements for recording conversations. Washington was a 2-party consent state, which meant both parties had to agree to be recorded. But Mason wasn't planning to use these recordings in court. He was planning to use them for something more immediate. Jason answered the door wearing jeans and a polo shirt, looking more relaxed than Mason had ever seen him. "Mark, come in, come in. Welcome to our little slice of paradise." The interior was as impressive as the exterior. Soaring ceilings, modern art, furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Jason led him through a series of rooms, each more opulent than the last, before arriving at a home theater with leather recliners and a screen the size of a small movie theater. "Impressive," Mason said, meaning it. "Amelia picked out most of the decor. She's got excellent taste." Jason's tone was neutral, but Mason caught something underneath. Resentment, maybe, or boredom. "She's traveling for business?" "Defense Contracting Conference in D.C. 3 days of listening to generals talk about budget priorities and threat assessments. I used to go with her, but honestly, it's not my scene." Jason opened the wine Mason had brought and poured 2 generous glasses. "So tell me more about your background. Cascade Technical is a small firm. What brought you there?" Mason had rehearsed this story dozens of times. "After the Army, I wanted to stay connected to defense work, but on a smaller scale. More personal relationships, less bureaucracy. Cascade gave me the chance to work on interesting problems without getting lost in a corporate hierarchy. Smart. The big contractors can be soul-crushing. All politics and process, no real innovation? Is that your experience with Covington Dynamics?" Jason's expression tightened slightly. "Let's just say working with family has its complications, such as never being sure whether you're valued for your contributions or your last name." Jason took a long sip of wine. "Victor Covington built that company through sheer force of will, but he's never quite figured out how to delegate authority without micromanaging every decision. That must be frustrating for Amelia. It's frustrating for everyone. She's brilliant, probably smarter than her father, but he treats her like she's still in college." "And me?" Jason laughed bitterly. "I'm the son-in-law who's supposed to smile and look grateful for whatever scraps of involvement they throw my way." Mason sensed an opening. "Is that why you started your own ventures?" "Partly. I needed something that was mine, you know? Something Victor couldn't control or manipulate." "The cryptocurrency operation?" Jason nodded, then caught himself. "How much do you know about that?" "Only what you mentioned at the conference, but I've been thinking about it, and I'm interested in learning more." For the next hour, Jason walked Mason through the details of his various schemes with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely got to discuss his accomplishments. The cryptocurrency mining operation was just the beginning. He'd also been investing in real estate development projects, private equity funds, and startup companies, all funded through a complex web of loans and transfers that he seemed to believe were clever rather than criminal. "The key," Jason explained, "is diversification and discretion. You spread the risk across multiple investments, and you keep the money flowing through enough different accounts that no single transaction looks suspicious." "And Amelia knows about all this?" Jason's expression darkened. "Amelia knows what she needs to know. She's got her focus. I've got mine. But the money you're investing, some of it comes from her trust fund, doesn't it?" "That's complicated." Mason leaned forward, adopting the conspiratorial tone that had worked so well at the conference. "How complicated?" Jason stared into his wineglass for a long moment before answering. "Amelia and I have a prenup, but it's not exactly traditional. Her father insisted on terms that give her control over most of the assets, but they also give me access to certain accounts for business development purposes. Business development purposes being whatever I decide they are. The language is deliberately vague." Mason felt a chill of recognition. "So you're using her money to fund investments she doesn't know about?" "I'm using our money to build our future. There's a difference." "Is there?" Jason's tone turned defensive. "Look, Amelia spends more on clothes in a month than most people make in a year. She drives a car that costs more than most people's houses. She's not exactly worried about money, but she might be worried about how it's being used. She might be. Which is why we don't discuss every detail of our financial arrangements." The conversation continued for another hour, with Jason revealing layer after layer of financial impropriety, while Mason nodded and asked encouraging questions. By the time the evening ended, Mason had enough recorded admissions to destroy Jason's life several times over. But he also had something else: confirmation that his brother's marriage was built on lies, theft, and mutual contempt. Jason was stealing from Amelia, Amelia was apparently having affairs, and both of them were participating in defrauding the government. It was a house of cards waiting to collapse. Mason just needed to provide the right gust of wind. The next morning, he called Shireen from a secure phone. "We need to meet. Emergency session." They met at the central library, in the reading room, where whispered conversations blended into the ambient hush of turning pages and clicking keyboards. "I've got everything we need," Mason said, sliding a flash drive across the table. "Financial records, recorded admissions, details about the money laundering operation." "It's all there." Shireen plugged the drive into her laptop and started scrolling through the files. Her expression grew more amazed with each page. "This is incredible! How did you get him to admit all this?" "He wanted to impress me." Classic narcissist behavior. He couldn't resist showing off how clever he thought he was being. "This changes everything. With this evidence, the FBI could move immediately." "That's the plan." "But there's something else." Mason explained what he'd learned about Jason and Amelia's marriage, their financial arrangements, and the various ways they were betraying each other. "Personal leverage," Shireen mused. "If we could expose the affairs and the financial crimes simultaneously, it would create chaos, and when people are in chaos, they make mistakes." "What kind of mistakes?" Mason smiled for the first time in months, the kind that destroy their lives completely. That afternoon, Mason made 3 phone calls. The first was to Agent Huang at the FBI. "I've got everything you need. When can we meet?" The second was to a private investigator Shireen had recommended. "I need surveillance on 2 subjects. Comprehensive coverage for the next 2 weeks." The third was to a reporter at the Seattle Times, who specialized in defense contracting scandals. "I've got a story that's going to blow your mind, but I need you to hold it until I give you the green light." The endgame was finally beginning. The Seattle Times published the expose on a Wednesday morning in late October under the headline, "Northwest Defense Contractor Under Federal Investigation." The article, written by investigative reporter Jennifer Park, laid out the basic allegations against Covington Dynamics in careful, legally vetted language. But the real bombshell came in the sidebar article, "Family Connections Complicate Federal Probe." That piece detailed Jason Briggs' marriage to Amelia Covington, his various business ventures, and the questions surrounding his use of family money to fund personal investments. It stopped short of directly accusing him of theft, but the implications were clear to anyone who could read between the lines. Mason read both articles from his apartment in Ballard, drinking coffee and watching the October rain streak his windows. By noon, his phone was buzzing with text messages from reporters who'd somehow obtained his contact information. By 2 o'clock, there were news vans parked outside Covington Dynamics headquarters in Redmond. By 5 o'clock, Amelia Covington Briggs was calling an emergency press conference. Mason watched it live on his laptop, studying his former fiancée's face as she stood behind a podium in the lobby of her father's corporate headquarters. She looked composed but tense, her usual poise undermined by the stress of the last few hours. "I want to address the allegations that have been made in today's Seattle Times," she began, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Covington Dynamics has always operated with the highest ethical standards, and we welcome any investigation that will demonstrate our commitment to integrity and transparency." She was good, Mason had to admit. Even under pressure, she projected the kind of calm authority that came from years of preparation for moments like this. "Regarding questions about my husband's business activities," she continued, "I want to be clear that Mr. Briggs' investments are his own affair and have no connection to Covington Dynamics or its government contracts." That was interesting. In one sentence, she'd thrown Jason under the bus while trying to protect the family business. The marriage might be over in all but name, but the Covington fortune still needed to be preserved. "I will not be taking questions at this time," Amelia concluded. "But I want to assure our employees, our partners, and the American taxpayers who depend on our products that Covington Dynamics will emerge from this investigation stronger than ever." She walked away from the podium without looking back, leaving a room full of reporters shouting questions at her departing figure. Mason closed the laptop and reached for his phone. It was time for the next phase. Jason answered on the second ring, his voice tight with stress. "Mark? Jesus, I'm glad you called. This whole thing is a nightmare." "I saw the news. Are you okay?" "Am I okay? My wife just threw me to the wolves on live television. The FBI wants to interview me tomorrow. My business accounts are frozen pending investigation, so no, I'm not okay." "Where are you?" "Hotel downtown, the Fairmont. Amelia changed the locks on the house and had security escort me off the property." Mason felt a moment of genuine surprise. Amelia had moved faster than he'd expected. That's harsh. That's calculated. She's protecting herself and her father's business by making me the scapegoat for everything. Is that what you are? The scapegoat? Jason was quiet for a long moment. Can we meet? I need to talk to someone who understands the business side of this. Of course. Where? Hotel bar, 9 o'clock. And Mark, be careful who you're seen with. This thing is about to get ugly. The Fairmont's bar was nearly empty when Mason arrived, which made sense given that it was a Wednesday night in Seattle during the rainy season. Jason sat alone at a corner table, working on what looked like his third or fourth whiskey. He looked terrible. His usual polish had been replaced by stubble, bloodshot eyes, and the kind of rumpled clothing that suggested he'd been wearing the same outfit for 24 hours. You came? Jason said as Mason sat down. You sounded like you needed to talk. I need to figure out how to survive this. Financially, legally, personally, everything I've built is falling apart. Mason ordered a beer and studied his brother's face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. What do the lawyers say? They say I'm screwed. Federal fraud charges, money laundering, conspiracy. They're talking about 15 to 20 years in prison. That's if you're convicted. Mark, they have recordings, financial records, email conversations. The only question is how many other people go down with me. Mason's pulse quickened. Recordings? FBI played them for my lawyer this afternoon. Conversations I had with business partners about moving money around, structuring transactions to avoid reporting requirements. Stuff I thought was private. How is that possible? Jason finished his whiskey and signaled for another. Someone's been cooperating with them. Someone with access to information and the technical ability to record conversations without being detected. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Mason kept his expression neutral while his mind raced. The FBI had moved faster than expected, which meant someone had provided them with additional evidence beyond what Mason had supplied. Any idea who? Could be anyone. Business partner, employee, family member. Hell, could be someone I've never even met who's been watching from a distance. Jason's new drink arrived, and he took a large sip before continuing. The worst part is that Amelia is acting like she had no idea what I was doing. Like she's some innocent sufferer who got fooled by her criminal husband. Maybe she is. Bees. She knew exactly what was happening. She signed the papers, authorized the transfers, attended the meetings. She's just smart enough to have kept her fingerprints off the obvious crimes. Then why isn't she being charged? Because she's a Covington. Because her family has connections that go back decades. Because the government needs someone to cooperate against the bigger fish. Mason felt pieces clicking into place. She's made a deal. That's my guess. Testify against me and her father. Get immunity or a reduced sentence. Keep most of the family money. It's actually brilliant in a completely sociopathic way. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Jason's situation settling over them like a fog. There's something else, Jason said finally. Something the lawyers don't know yet. What? The cryptocurrency mining operation. It's not just money laundering. Some of the electricity we've been using comes from facilities that handle classified materials. We might have inadvertently violated the Espionage Act. Mason felt his blood turn cold. Espionage charges? Possible. Depends on how creative the prosecutors want to get. But if they can prove we had access to classified information through the power grid connections, that's capital punishment territory. That's life without parole territory, which is essentially the same thing. Jason finished his drink and stared at the empty glass. You know what the really ironic part is? I did all this to prove I was worthy of being a Covington. To show that I could build something as impressive as what Victor built. And now Victor's going to watch me go to prison while he and his daughter walk away clean. Mason felt something unexpected. A flicker of sympathy for his brother. Not forgiveness, but recognition that Jason had been manipulated and used just as much as Mason had been. Is there anything you can do? Any leverage you have over them? Jason looked up sharply. Why do you ask? Because if you're going down anyway, you might as well take them with you. That's a dangerous line of thinking. Is it more dangerous than spending the rest of your life in federal prison? Jason considered this while he signaled the bartender for another round. There might be something, information that could hurt them. But using it would be like setting off a nuclear bomb. It would destroy everyone, including me. What kind of information? Jason leaned closer, lowering his voice. Victor Covington didn't build his company through hard work and innovation. He built it through blackmail and homicide. The words hit Mason like a physical blow. Homicide? Industrial accidents that weren't accidents. Competitors who died in convenient plane crashes. Whistleblowers who committed self-destruction by shooting themselves in the back of the head. Victor's been eliminating threats for 40 years. Do you have proof? I have documents. Financial records showing payments to private military contractors. Communication logs that detail surveillance operations. Victor kept everything because he's paranoid about being betrayed by his own people. And you have access to these files? I did. Amelia gave me the codes years ago when Victor had his heart attack and we thought he might die. She wanted someone outside the immediate family to have backup access to critical information. Mason's mind was racing. If Jason was telling the truth, this was bigger than fraud or money laundering. This was organized crime on a corporate scale. Where are the files now? Encrypted drives in a safety deposit box, along with some other insurance policies I've been accumulating over the years. Other insurance policies? Jason smiled for the first time that evening, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Evidence of Amelia's affairs. Photos, video, financial records showing payments to various men over the past 3 years. Victor doesn't know his precious daughter has been running around on me since almost the beginning of our marriage. You've been collecting evidence of her affairs? I've been protecting myself. I knew this day would come eventually. The day when the Covington family decided I was more liability than asset. I just didn't expect it to happen so soon. Mason sat back in his chair, processing everything he'd just learned. Jason wasn't just a petty criminal who'd gotten in over his head. He was a man who'd been systematically documenting his family's crimes while committing his own, creating a mutually assured destruction scenario that could bring down one of the most powerful defense contracting dynasties in the country. What are you planning to do with all this information? I don't know yet. My lawyers say cooperation is my best option, but cooperation means giving up everything and hoping the prosecutors keep their word about reduced sentences. Using the nuclear option means guaranteed mutual destruction, but also guaranteed revenge. Jason looked at him with something approaching respect. You understand? I understand wanting to see them pay for what they've done. They destroyed my life. Our life. They turned us against each other, used us both, and then threw us away when we stopped being useful. The conversation continued for another hour, with Jason revealing more details about the Covington family's criminal enterprises and his own role in documenting them. By the time they parted ways, Mason had a clear understanding of the scope of what they were dealing with. He also had a plan for how to use this information to his advantage. The next morning, Mason called Agent Huang from a payphone outside a grocery store in West Seattle. I need an emergency meeting. My source has additional information about the Covington case. Information that changes everything. What kind of information? The kind that turns a fraud investigation into a conspiracy case involving multiple homicides. There was a long pause before Huang responded. Where do you want to meet? Federal Building, 1 hour, and Agent Huang, you're going to want to bring your boss. 2 hours later, Mason sat in the same conference room where he'd first approached the FBI, but this time the room was packed. Agent Huang, Prosecutor Walsh, 2 additional FBI agents, and a man in an expensive suit who'd been introduced as Deputy Assistant Attorney General Robert Chen from the Justice Department's Organized Crime Section. Mr. Stevens, Chen began, Agent Huang tells me you have information about additional crimes connected to the Covington investigation. That's correct, but before I share it, I need assurances about my own safety and legal status. What kind of assurances? Witness protection if necessary, immunity from any charges related to my undercover activities, and guarantee that my real identity remains sealed. Chen and Walsh exchanged glances. That's a significant request. What kind of information are we talking about? Mason opened his laptop and connected it to the conference room's projection system. We're talking about a 40-year pattern of eliminating business competitors and potential whistleblowers through homicide disguised as accidents and self-destructions. The room went completely silent. We're talking about a defense contracting company that's essentially a criminal organization with government clearances and billion-dollar contracts. Mason clicked through a series of documents Jason had provided him the night before. Financial, records, communication logs, surveillance reports. Each page revealed another layer of the Covington family's criminal enterprise. And we're talking about a federal investigation that's currently focused on the small fish while the sharks are preparing to disappear into the deep water. When Mason finished his presentation, Chen was the first to speak. How did you obtain these documents? My source provided them. He's willing to cooperate fully in exchange for protection and consideration in his own sentencing. Your source being Jason Brigg. That's correct. Walsh leaned forward. Why is he willing to cooperate now? Yesterday, his lawyers were talking about fighting the charges because he found out his wife is planning to testify against him while she walks away with immunity, because he realizes the Covington family has been using him as a fall guy from the beginning, and because he's angry enough to burn down everything they've built. Chen closed the folder of documents and looked around the room. This investigation just became a national security matter. If these allegations are true, we're not just talking about fraud. We're talking about a criminal organization that's been manipulating defense contracts for decades while eliminating anyone who threatened their operations. What does that mean for the timeline? Mason asked. It means we move fast, Chen replied. Fast enough to prevent any evidence from being destroyed. Fast enough to prevent additional witnesses from being eliminated. Fast enough to prevent the Covington family from disappearing into countries without extradition treaties. Agent Huang spoke up. What do you need from us, Mr. Stevens? I need you to arrest Victor Covington before he realizes how much evidence his son-in-law has collected. I need you to freeze all Covington family assets before they can be moved offshore. And I need you to put Amelia Covington in a position where cooperation is her only option. And in exchange? In exchange, I guarantee you'll have enough evidence to dismantle one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the defense contracting industry. Chen stood up and shook Mason's hand. Welcome to the Justice Department's Witness Protection Program, Mr. Stevens. We'll be in touch within 24 hours with details about how this operation will proceed. As Mason walked out of the federal building for the second time in a week, he felt something he hadn't experienced in over a year. The certainty that justice was not only possible, but inevitable. The Covington family had spent decades believing they were untouchable. They were about to learn how wrong they'd been, but, more importantly, they were about to learn what happened when someone they'd betrayed decided to fight back with their own weapons. The end game was finally here. 3 days later, the coordinated arrests began at dawn. Victor Covington was taken into custody at his Mercer Island estate while he was having breakfast with 2 DoD officials who were supposedly there to discuss budget allocations for the next fiscal year. The FBI agents who arrested him presented a warrant that detailed 47 separate charges, ranging from fraud and money laundering to conspiracy to commit homicide and violations of the Espionage Act. Jason Brigg was arrested at the Fairmont Hotel, where he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. He didn't resist or ask for lawyers. He simply asked if he could call his mother to let her know he was okay. Amelia Covington was arrested at SeaTac Airport as she attempted to board a private jet bound for Switzerland. In her carry-on luggage, federal agents found $500,000 in cash, 3 different passports, and encrypted hard drives containing what appeared to be additional evidence of her family's criminal activities. The arrests made the national news by lunchtime, with every major network running footage of Victor Covington being led away in handcuffs, while reporters shouted questions about the scope of the federal investigation. Mason watched the coverage from his apartment, feeling a satisfaction that was deeper and more complete than anything he'd experienced in years. But the real moment of vindication came that evening, when his phone rang with a call from an unknown number. Hello? Mason? It's your mother. Linda Briggs' voice was soft, tentative, as if she wasn't sure he would want to talk to her. Hi, Mom. I saw the news about Jason and the Covingtons. I wanted to call and tell you, I'm sorry. Sorry for what? For not standing up for you when your father threw you out, for letting them treat you like you were the problem, for not seeing what was really happening. Mason closed his eyes, feeling emotions he'd kept buried for over a year finally surface. It's okay, Mom. No, it's not okay. You were right about everything. The corruption, the fraud, the way they used you and then discarded you. You were right, and we were wrong. How's Dad taking it? Linda was quiet for a moment. Your father he's having a hard time. The Tesla was repossessed yesterday. His pension is under investigation because of the gifts he received from Covington Dynamics. He's starting to understand that he was being used too. I'm sorry to hear that. Don't be sorry. Be proud. You did the right thing even when it cost you everything, even when your own family turned against you. They talked for another 20 minutes, and by the time Mason hung up, he felt something he hadn't experienced since the day he'd walked out of his father's backyard. Peace. The next morning brought news that Jason had agreed to plead guilty to 12 federal charges in exchange for his cooperation in the case against the Covington family. His sentence would be 15 years in federal prison, but with good behavior and continued cooperation, he could be released in as little as 10 years. Amelia's situation was more complex. She was fighting the charges while simultaneously trying to negotiate a cooperation agreement that would allow her to retain some portion of her family's assets. Her lawyers were claiming she'd been manipulated and controlled by her father and husband, but the evidence of her direct participation in various crimes made that defense difficult to sustain. Victor Covington was refusing to cooperate at all, maintaining his innocence, and claiming that any criminal activity was the work of rogue employees, acting without his knowledge or consent. His legal team was comprised of some of the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in the country, and they were preparing for a trial that could last years. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and more was emerging every day as federal agents executed search warrants and interviewed witnesses. The story of Covington Dynamics was being rewritten from a tale of entrepreneurial success to a decades-long criminal conspiracy that had manipulated government contracts while eliminating anyone who posed a threat. Mason's role in the investigation remained secret, protected by the witness protection protocols he'd negotiated with the Justice Department. Officially, he was still Mark Stevens, a systems engineer who'd provided technical expertise to the federal investigation. Unofficially, he was the architect of the case that had brought down one of the most powerful families in the defense contracting industry. 6 months after the arrests, Mason received a call from Prosecutor Walsh with news he'd been waiting to hear. "The plea negotiations are complete," she told him. "Victor Covington has agreed to plead guilty to 23 federal charges in exchange for a sentence of life without parole. Amelia Covington has agreed to plead guilty to 14 charges in exchange for 25 years in federal prison and forfeiture of 90% of her assets." What about restitution? The government has recovered over $400 million in fraudulent proceeds. As the primary whistleblower in the case, you're entitled to a substantial reward under federal statutes. How substantial? $40 million, after taxes. Mason sat in silence for a moment, processing the number. $40 million was more money than he'd ever imagined having, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life without ever working again. But more importantly, it was justice. It was validation that he'd been right to walk away from their corrupt world, right to refuse their blood money, right to sacrifice everything in pursuit of the truth. "There's one more thing," Walsh continued. "The civil asset forfeiture case has been resolved. All of the Covington family's assets have been seized, including their real estate holdings, business interests, and personal property. But there's a wrinkle." "What kind of wrinkle?" "The company that filed the civil lawsuit to recover fraudulent proceeds. We've discovered it's owned by a shell corporation that traces back to an entity called Stevens Family Holdings." Mason smiled, remembering the final piece of his plan. "And Stevens Family Holdings appears to be owned by someone named Mark Stevens. Someone with your social security number and banking information. That's interesting. It means that in addition to your whistleblower reward, you're also entitled to the civil recovery proceeds as the plaintiff in the forfeiture case. Another $60 million. $100 million total. Mason had gone from sleeping on a couch in his father's basement to becoming one of the wealthiest men in Seattle, all while destroying the people who'd betrayed him. "Mr. Stevens?" Walsh's voice brought him back to the present. "Yes? Congratulations. You've achieved something remarkable. Complete victory over people who thought they were untouchable." After Mason hung up, he sat in his apartment, looking out at the Seattle skyline and thinking about the future. He could go anywhere, do anything, become anyone he wanted to be. The question was, who did he want to become? His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "I know who you really are. We need to talk." Amelia. Even from federal prison, she was still trying to play games. Mason deleted the message without responding. He'd learned something important over the past year. The best revenge wasn't destruction. It was success. The best way to defeat your enemies wasn't to become like them. It was to become better than them. Mason Brigg had been destroyed by betrayal and injustice, but Mark Stevens had been forged by those same experiences into something stronger, smarter, and more dangerous than his enemies had ever imagined possible. The old Mason was gone forever. But Mark Stevens was just getting started. He opened his laptop and began typing an email to Shireen Vega. "New project, international scope. Interested?" The defense contracting industry was full of corrupt companies and criminal families who thought their money and connections made them untouchable. They were all about to learn how wrong they were. Because Mark Stevens had $100 million, unlimited time, and a very long memory. And he was just getting started.